The afternoon sun cast dappled shadows through the ancient elm trees of St. Mildred's vicarage, where the annual harvest fete had transformed the usually sedate grounds into a tableau of quintessential English village life. Bunting fluttered between the rose trellises in patriotic red, white, and blue triangles, while trestled tables groaned under the weight of Victoria sponges, jam tarts, and the season's final offerings from cottage gardens throughout Little Wickham. Miss Jane Marple had positioned herself with characteristic discretion beneath the copper beech, her knitting bag at her feet, and a cup of perfectly brewed tea balanced on the weathered garden table beside her. From this vantage point, she could observe the gentle ebb and flow of village society with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 7 decades watching human nature reveal itself in all its fascinating complexity. The preserve judging table had been arranged with ceremonial precision near the church wall, its white damask cloth gleaming in the afternoon light. Each entry wore a modest paper cap fastened with string or elastic, like small soldiers awaiting inspection. The jars themselves caught the sunlight: ruby raspberry, golden marmalade, deep purple damson, each representing hours of careful preparation and no small amount of village pride. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the judging table, not merely by the colorful display, but by the peculiar tension that seemed to emanate from the small crowd gathered around it. Mr. Lionel Bennet, the village's retired solicitor and self-appointed arbiter of all things proper, stood at the head of the table with his judging implements arranged with military precision. A small silver knife, a row of tasting spoons in a shallow dish of water, and a red and white checked napkin folded just so. What struck Miss Marple as particularly interesting was not Mr. Bennet himself, though his waistcoat seemed rather warm for such a pleasant September day, but rather the behavior of those waiting to have their preserves judged. Mrs. Grace Poddle hovered nearby with the aggressive anxiety of someone defending a championship, while newcomer Mrs. Verity Lake stood apart, her hands clasped tightly before her in a way that suggested she was practicing being invisible. Mrs. Lake had arrived in Little Wickham only 3 months prior, renting the small lodge at Harrow End, the property everyone still called the house where Sunday never came, after its previous owner's peculiar habits. Old Mr. Thornbury had been a man of fierce routine who despised interruption, particularly the Sunday bells and the foot traffic of churchgoers. Even now, 2 years after his death, something of that Sunday-shunning atmosphere seemed to cling to the property. Miss Marple noticed how Mrs. Lake's gaze kept drifting toward that distant house, visible through a gap in the hedgerow, its windows reflecting the afternoon sun like watching eyes. There was something in the woman's expression, a wariness that went beyond simple nervousness about having her preserves judged. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Bennet announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "We shall begin with the raspberry entries." The crowd pressed closer, and Miss Marple observed the subtle choreography of village social dynamics. She noticed how Dr. Markham positioned himself, where he could see both the judging and monitor the crowd, the instinctive placement of someone trained to watch for trouble. She saw how young Timothy Ashford, the new curate, kept glancing toward Mrs. Lake with what might have been sympathy or something more complex. Most intriguingly, she observed how Mrs. Lake's fingers worried at a loose thread on her sleeve, a fine blue thread that seemed to catch and hold her attention with unusual intensity. Mr. Bennet began his methodical tasting, cleaning his spoon between samples with the precise movements of a man who believed in proper procedure. "Excellent set," he pronounced after the first jar, perhaps a touch enthusiastic with the sugar, but well within acceptable parameters. Miss Marple's keen eyes noted several small details that others might have missed. The way the water in the spoon dish had been recently changed, evidenced by soap bubbles still clinging to the rim, a small damp spot on the white cloth where the dish had been moved and replaced. And most curiously, a fine blue thread that had somehow found its way onto the judging table, lying almost invisibly against the white damask. "Greengage," Mr. Bennet continued, moving to Mrs. Pottle's entry with the air of a judge approaching a familiar defendant. The previous year's Greengage debacle, as Mrs. Ainsworth had whispered to Miss Marple earlier, had involved accusations of artificial enhancement and had nearly resulted in a schism in the Women's Institute. As Mr. Bennet worked his way through the entries, Miss Marple found her attention increasingly drawn to the small details that others overlooked. The way Mrs. Lake's breathing had become shallow as her turn approached. The manner in which the curate's collar had begun to show perspiration despite the mild temperature. The fact that Dr. Markham had moved closer to the table, his medical bag somehow having materialized in his hand. "Black currant," Mr. Bennet announced, reaching for Mrs. Lake's entry. The jar's paper cap bore a small stain, as if someone had steadied it with a finger marked by something dark. As he lifted the cap with his silver knife, Miss Marple saw the fine blue thread catch and break, falling unnoticed onto the white cloth. Mr. Bennet tasted, paused, and frowned. "Interesting," he said, which in his vocabulary was not necessarily a compliment. Rather, intense flavor profile. Mrs. Lake's face flushed. "I used less sugar than the recipe called for," she offered quietly. "I thought it might allow the fruit's natural character to come through more clearly." "Indeed," Mr. Bennet replied with the tone of someone making a note for future reference. The judging continued with mechanical precision until Mr. Bennet reached the final entry. Mrs. Pottle's strawberry preserve. As he removed the cap and dipped his spoon, Miss Marple noticed how the afternoon light caught the contents, revealing what might have been an unusual consistency, though it was difficult to be certain from her position beneath the beech tree. Mr. Bennet tasted, and his expression shifted from professional assessment to something approaching confusion. His hand moved instinctively to his throat, then to his stomach. The spoon slipped from his fingers, striking the jar with a small chime before falling to the cloth, leaving a curved smear of red preserve like an accusation. For a moment, that seemed to stretch far longer than it actually lasted. Mr. Bennet stood perfectly still, as if listening to something only he could hear. Then his face began to change color, taking on a grayish pallor that had nothing to do with the afternoon light. "I say," he began, but the words emerged as little more than a whisper. His legs seemed to forget their purpose, and he sat down hard on nothing at all before toppling sideways against the table. Jars jumped and rattled, their careful arrangement dissolving into chaos. Dr. Markham was there almost before Mr. Bennet hit the ground, his medical training overriding social protocol. But even from her position across the lawn, Miss Marple could see from the doctor's expression that his ministrations would be futile. The Reverend Ainsworth appeared with the peculiar calm that clergy develop for dealing with crises, while his wife began the complex task of managing a crowd that was rapidly oscillating between curiosity and horror. "Heart attack, most likely," someone whispered, but Miss Marple noticed how Dr. Markham's face had set into the careful neutrality that medical professionals adopt when they suspect something more complex than natural causes. As the crowd swirled around the fallen man and urgent voices began calling for help, Miss Marple remained in her chair beneath the copper beech, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Her sharp blue eyes moved methodically across the scene, cataloguing details that others were too shocked or too busy to notice. The fine blue thread on the white cloth. The way Mrs. Lake had gone very still, her face pale but her eyes alert. The manner in which the curate had stepped protectively closer to the newcomer. The fact that the spoon dish had been moved again, this time leaving a different watermark on the cloth. And most telling of all, the way several pairs of eyes had turned, almost involuntarily, toward the gap in the hedgerow where the house where Sunday never came stood silent and watchful in the afternoon sun, as if the events of this Saturday had somehow awakened whatever restless spirits had been disturbed by old Mr. Thornberry's peculiar habits. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap and prepared to do what she did best, watch, listen, and wait for human nature to reveal its secrets. In her long experience, it always did. given time and the proper attention to detail. The harvest fate had become something else entirely, and she suspected that before this matter was resolved, the quiet village of Little Wickham would discover that some secrets, like some houses, resist the intrusion of ordinary days, even Sundays. The shock of Mr. Bennet's collapse rippled through the harvest fate like a stone dropped into still water, transforming the gentle afternoon gathering into something altogether more sinister. Dr. Markham rose from his examination with the grim finality that only medical men can convey, his brief nod to the Reverend Ainsworth confirming what the gathered villagers had begun to suspect. The preserved judging table, moments before a symbol of innocent competition, now stood as an altar of tragedy, its white damask cloth bearing witness to something far more serious than disputed jam recipes. Miss Marple remained in her chair beneath the copper beech, observing the curious choreography that follows sudden death in small communities. The initial stunned silence gave way to urgent whispers, then to the peculiar energy of collective speculation. She watched with the practiced eye of someone who understood that truth often emerged not from what people said in such moments, but from what their behavior revealed about their deeper concerns and hidden knowledge. Mrs. Grace Pottle was among the first to voice the comfortable theory that would allow the village to maintain its sense of safety. "His heart," she declared to anyone within earshot, though her pale complexion and trembling hands suggested her own distress ran deeper than mere neighborly concern. Poor Mr. Bennet always took these responsibilities too seriously. The strain of judging, you know. Yet Miss Marple noticed how Mrs. Pottle's gaze kept returning to her own strawberry preserve, still sitting accusingly on the table, and how she seemed to be testing the reception of her words, rather than simply expressing grief. Young Timothy Ashford had positioned himself protectively near Mrs. Lake, who had retreated into the shadows with the instinctive movement of someone accustomed to avoiding scrutiny. The curate's concern appeared genuine, but Miss Marple observed something more complex in his attention to the newcomer, a quality that suggested personal interest beyond pastoral duty. Mrs. Lake herself stood very still, her face pale but her eyes alert, scanning the crowd with the wariness of someone calculating potential threats. The arrival of Constable Davies marked the transition from village tragedy to official investigation. His obvious discomfort with the situation was evident in his nervous pacing and the way his pencil hovered uncertainly over his notebook. Little Wickham was not accustomed to sudden death, particularly not under such public circumstances, and the constable's inexperience showed in every hesitant movement. As the afternoon wore on, the theories multiplied with the peculiar creativity that accompanies shocking events. Colonel Bantry, ever dramatic, dismissed the heart attack explanation entirely. "Nonsense. Bennet was fit as a fiddle. That preserve looked distinctly off to me." His booming voice carried across the lawn, and Miss Marple noted how several pairs of eyes turned toward the judging table with new suspicion. The innocent jars of fruit preserves, each representing hours of careful preparation and village pride, suddenly took on a more sinister aspect. Dr. Markham's quiet consultation with the constable proved to be the catalyst that transformed speculation into something more serious. Though their words were too low to be overheard, the doctor's grave expression and the constable's subsequent wide-eyed response spoke volumes. The whisper began as a barely audible suggestion, but gained strength as it passed from person to person. Poison. The word itself seemed to electrify the gathering, sending fresh waves of fear and excitement through the crowd. Mrs. Hartley, from behind the cake stall, was among the first to embrace the dramatic possibility, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper as she shared tales of exotic toxins from her sister's brother's military service in India. Others recoiled from such sensational suggestions, preferring the comfort of natural explanations, but the seed had been planted. Miss Marple observed how quickly the village divided into camps, those who clung to the safety of medical explanations and those who found a perverse thrill in the possibility of murder among them. She noticed Mrs. Lake's increasing pallor as the poison theory gained traction, and the way Timothy Ashford moved even closer to her, as if his presence could somehow shield her from the growing suspicion. The transformation was complete when several villagers began to eye the preserve jars with open mistrust. What had been symbols of community pride and friendly competition now appeared as potential weapons, their innocent paper caps and cheerful labels suddenly sinister. The careful arrangements of the judging table, disturbed by Mr. Bennet's collapse, took on new significance as people began to wonder what might have been deliberately altered or concealed. As evening approached and the fete grounds slowly emptied, Miss Marple remained, her keen eyes cataloguing the details that others had missed in their shock and speculation. The fine blue thread, the moved water dish, the careful positioning of certain individuals, all pieces of a puzzle that was only beginning to reveal itself. The house where Sunday never came stood silent in the distance, its windows reflecting the dying light like watching eyes, and Miss Marple suspected that before this matter was resolved, its secrets would prove central to understanding what had truly happened on this most unusual Saturday afternoon. The morning after the harvest fete brought that peculiar quality of light that follows tragedy in small villages, where familiar surroundings seem subtly altered by the weight of recent events. Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage with measured steps, her knitting bag at her side, and her sharp blue eyes already cataloguing the changes that death had wrought upon Little Wycombe's peaceful facade. Mrs. Ainsworth greeted her at the kitchen door with weary gratitude, her usual composure frayed at the edges. The vicarage kitchen, normally a haven of domestic order, bore the subtle signs of disruption: teacups arranged in nervous patterns, a dishcloth twisted into anxious knots, and the lingering tension that follows shocking revelations. "Miss Marple, do come in," Mrs. Ainsworth murmured, gesturing toward the scrubbed pine table where 3 women had already gathered like iron filings drawn to a magnet of crisis. Mrs. Pottle sat with her hands clasped tightly before her, her usual commanding presence notably diminished. Young Edie Pell from the Girl Guides hovered near the sink, her competent demeanor shadowed by genuine distress. Mrs. Hartley occupied the chair nearest the window, her voice already carrying the theatrical whisper of someone who had appointed herself the tragedy's chief chronicler. "Such a dreadful business," Mrs. Hartley was saying as Miss Marple settled herself quietly. "And so sudden. Poor Mr. Bennet seemed perfectly well when he began the judging." "He was particular about the water for the spoons," Edie offered hesitantly. "Asked me to change it twice. Said it had gone sticky the first time." She bit her lip, then added with the precision of youth, "The curate helped me move the dish the second time. Said I mustn't fuss." Miss Marple's needles began their gentle rhythm, but her attention remained fixed on the girl's words. "How thoughtful of Mr. Ashford," she observed mildly. "Young clergymen are often so helpful at such events." Mrs. Pottle shifted uncomfortably. "My preserve was perfectly sound," she declared with defensive emphasis. "I've made that same strawberry recipe since 1938. Never harmed a soul." Her voice carried the strain of someone who had spent the night rehearsing justifications. "Of course, dear," Miss Marple replied gently, "though I have often noticed that the most innocent things can become dangerous in the wrong hands. Rather like kitchen knives, perfectly harmless until someone decides to use them improperly." The arrival of Timothy Ashford interrupted the conversation, his youthful face drawn with fatigue and concern. "Mrs. Ainsworth, I've telephoned the county. An inspector is coming this afternoon." He paused, seeming to notice Miss Marple for the first time. "I've asked Mrs. Lake to wait in the vestry. She seemed quite shaken." "How is the poor woman managing?" Miss Marple inquired with innocent interest. "It must be particularly difficult, being new to the village." The curate's face flushed slightly. "She's bearing up well, considering, though I fear some people are already—" He trailed off, unwilling to voice the suspicions that had begun circulating like morning mist. "Already wondering about newcomers," Miss Marple finished kindly. "Human nature, I'm afraid. When something disturbing happens, we look first at what's unfamiliar rather than examining what we think we know well. Mrs. Hartley leaned forward conspiratorially. She did say she used less sugar in her preserve. Made it taste peculiar, I'm sure. Not that it would cause, well, what happened to poor Mr. Bennet? Less sugar, Miss Marple mused, her needles pausing momentarily. How interesting. I've noticed that people often make small changes to familiar recipes when they're nervous or distracted. Sometimes those changes reveal more about their state of mind than their cooking skills. The sound of heavy footsteps in the hall announced the arrival of Constable Davies, his notebook clutched like a lifeline. Behind him came a broad-shouldered man with careful eyes, who introduced himself as Inspector Lennox. Miss Marple observed how the inspector's gaze swept the room, cataloguing faces and noting the subtle tensions that crackled between the assembled women. "Ladies," Inspector Lennox began with professional courtesy, "I'll need to speak with everyone who had contact with the preserve entries or judging materials yesterday." As names were given and appointments arranged, Miss Marple continued her quiet observation. She noted Mrs. Pott's trembling hands, Timothy Ashford's protective glances toward the vestry door, and most intriguingly, the fine blue thread that still clung to Edie's dishcloth, the same shade she had observed on Mrs. Lake's sleeve and later on the judging table. When the official business concluded and the kitchen began to empty, Miss Marple remained, ostensibly to help Mrs. Ainsworth with the washing up. Through the scullery window, she could see the gap in the hedgerow where the house where Sunday never came stood silent in the morning light. Something about that distant building nagged at her memory. Not the house itself, but what it represented about secrets, isolation, and the peculiar ways that past and present could intertwine in places where everyone believed they knew everyone else's business. The inspector might focus on obvious evidence and clear motives, but Miss Marple understood that the truth often lay in the spaces between words, in the gestures people made when they thought no one was watching, and in the small details that seemed insignificant until viewed through the proper lens of human nature's infinite capacity for both love and malice. Inspector Lennox approached his investigation with the methodical precision of a man who preferred cases where evidence aligned neatly with obvious conclusions. By afternoon, his attention had crystallized around Mrs. Verity Lake with an intensity that suggested he had found his solution rather than merely pursuing leads. The newcomer's status, her admitted deviation from standard preserve recipes, and a rather unfortunate incident at the village shop that morning had combined to create what the inspector considered a compelling narrative. The interrogation took place in the vestry, where the scent of beeswax and old hymnals did little to steady Mrs. Lake's nerves. She sat with careful composure, her gloved hands folded precisely, while Inspector Lennox faced her across the narrow space. Miss Marple, ostensibly tidying hymn books along the shelf, observed the proceedings with the quiet attention that others had learned not to underestimate. "You entered a black currant preserve using less sugar than traditional recipes," Lennox began, his pencil poised over his notebook, an unusual choice for competition. "I wanted the fruit's natural character to come through," Mrs. Lake replied softly, though her voice carried a tremor that suggested deeper anxieties than simple nervousness about preserve judging. The inspector made careful notes, treating each deviation from village norms as potentially significant. Mrs. Lake's admission that she had handled only the paper cap on her jar, which had caught on a loose thread from her cardigan, seemed to provide him with particular satisfaction. The blue thread, Miss Marple noted, had appeared in several locations throughout the previous day's events. The morning's incident at Hartwell's grocery provided Inspector Lennox with what he considered adequate motive. Mrs. Higgins reported that Mrs. Lake had engaged in a sharp exchange with Mr. Bennet over delayed delivery of garden implements, calling him an interfering old busybody when he suggested that exotic plants might not thrive in Little Wickham's traditional soil. Village opinion coalesced around this emerging narrative with remarkable speed. Mrs. Pottle, relieved to have suspicion shifted from her strawberry preserve, subtly encouraged the consensus. "She's not from around here," she confided to anyone willing to listen. And that house she's taken always had a peculiar atmosphere. Old Mr. Thornbury grew all sorts of unusual plants there. Medicinal herbs, he claimed. The mention of medicinal herbs added another layer to the case against Mrs. Lake. Timothy Ashford, despite his obvious protective feelings toward the accused woman, reluctantly confirmed that her cottage contained extensive botanical references and carefully labeled jars of dried herbs. Her notebook, filled with detailed sketches and notes about plant properties and toxicity levels, seemed to provide the inspector with exactly the specialized knowledge required for sophisticated poisoning. Dr. Markham's preliminary examination had suggested a fast-acting, plant-based poison, which aligned perfectly with the inspector's theory. The delivery method through the preserve tasting, the victim's immediate collapse, and Mrs. Lake's presence at the judging table created what Lennox considered an airtight case. However, Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by the investigation's direction. During her afternoon visit to Mrs. Lake's cottage, she had observed details that painted a more complex picture. The botanical studies appeared to focus on healing rather than harming, with particular attention to cancer treatments. Timothy explained that Mrs. Lake had lost her husband to cancer the previous year and had been desperately researching alternative therapies that might have helped him. Moreover, Miss Marple's conversation with Mrs. Pottle had revealed an intriguing alternative possibility. The woman's defensive manner when discussing her preserve had given way to bitter commentary about Mr. Bennet's professional conduct. Her niece Cecily had apparently been denied access to a family trust controlled by Bennet's firm, with the solicitor demanding extensive documentation for what Mrs. Pottle considered a parade of humiliation over the girl's elopement with a traveling musician. As evening approached and the village settled into comfortable certainty about Mrs. Lake's guilt, Miss Marple reflected on the curious human tendency to embrace simple explanations for complex events. The inspector's efficiency in identifying an obvious suspect satisfied the community's need for swift resolution, but her long experience with human nature suggested that the truth rarely arranged itself so conveniently. The blue thread that had appeared at multiple locations, the careful positioning of various individuals around the judging table, and the subtle tensions she had observed between long-time residents all pointed toward a more intricate web of relationships and motives than the inspector's straightforward theory acknowledged. In her experience, when a community too eagerly embraced an outsider's guilt, it often indicated a collective desire to avoid examining uncomfortable truths about itself. The house where Sunday never came stood silent in the distance, its windows reflecting the dying light like watching eyes, and Miss Marple suspected that its secrets would prove more relevant to Mr. Bennet's death than the obvious evidence currently satisfying Inspector Lennox's methodical but limited investigation. The morning mist that clung to Little Wickham seemed to mirror the fog of confusion surrounding Mr. Bennet's death, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that clarity often emerged from the most careful attention to seemingly insignificant details. While Inspector Lennox continued building his methodical case against Mrs. Lake, Miss Marple found herself drawn to a small inconsistency that had been troubling her since the previous afternoon. Her destination was the parish hall, where Edie Pell was methodically folding the fate linens with the serious concentration of someone trying to restore order after chaos. The long trestle table, scrubbed clean and pale in the morning light, bore neat stacks of white napery, but Miss Marple's attention was caught by a single red and white checked napkin that lay apart from the others. That would be Mr. Bennet's personal napkin, Edie explained when she noticed Miss Marple's interested gaze. He brought it every year, said a gentleman should maintain his own standards. The girl's voice carried the careful precision of someone who had been thinking deeply about the previous day's events. Miss Marple settled herself nearby, her knitting needles beginning their familiar rhythm. You mentioned yesterday that Mr. Bennet asked you to change the water for the spoons twice. That seems rather particular, even for someone as precise as he was. Edie's face brightened at being asked for her observations rather than dismissed as too young to matter. The first time, he complained the water had gone sticky, though I'd only just filled the dish fresh from the tap. The second time, he said there might be soap residue affecting the taste, but I was certain I'd rinsed everything thoroughly. She paused, her brow furrowing with the effort of precise recollection. Mr. Ashford helped me move the dish that second time. He seemed quite nervous, kept glancing toward Mrs. Lake. And after you changed the water the second time, did you notice anything else unusual? Well, Edie said hesitantly, someone had moved the preserve jars slightly while I was fetching the fresh water. Not much, just enough to disturb the careful line I'd arranged them in. I thought perhaps Mr. Bennet had been examining them more closely, but when I looked around, he was talking to Colonel Bantry near the church wall. Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. This small detail lodged itself in her mind like a key turning in a lock. If Mr. Bennet hadn't moved the jars and Edie had been away fetching water, who had disturbed that careful arrangement? And more importantly, why? The water dish itself, Miss Marple continued gently. Did you notice anything about its position throughout the judging? Edie's expression grew more thoughtful. That's the curious thing, Miss Marple. I'm quite particular about keeping things tidy, and I remember exactly where I placed it each time. But during all the confusion after Mr. Bennet collapsed, when everyone was rushing about and Dr. Markham was attending to him, I noticed the dish had been moved again, just slightly, but enough to leave a fresh watermark on the cloth. This observation struck Miss Marple with the force of revelation, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. The timing was crucial. This third movement of the water dish had occurred not during the initial setup or the official water changes, but during the chaos that followed Mr. Bennet's collapse. Someone had deliberately adjusted something at the judging table while everyone's attention was focused on the fallen man. You have very sharp eyes, Edie, Miss Marple said approvingly. I suspect that small detail may prove more significant than it initially appears. As she made her way home through the village, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern that was beginning to emerge. The blue thread that had appeared at multiple locations had created a convenient trail leading directly to Mrs. Lake. Perhaps too convenient. In her long experience with human nature, Miss Marple had learned that when evidence pointed too obviously in one direction, it was worth examining what might be deliberately hidden in another. The third movement of the water dish, occurring during the confusion after Mr. Bennet's collapse, suggested someone with the presence of mind to take advantage of the chaos to obscure or remove evidence. This was not the panicked action of someone who had poisoned impulsively, but the calculated behavior of someone who had planned carefully and was now covering their tracks. Moreover, the person who had made this adjustment would have needed to be close enough to the judging table to reach it without drawing attention, yet not so obviously involved in helping Mr. Bennet that their absence from his side would be noticed. This required intimate knowledge of the fete's layout, the judging procedures, and the likely reactions of the other villagers. Miss Marple paused at her garden gate, looking back toward the gap in the hedgerow where Mrs. Lake's cottage stood silent in the morning mist. The house where Sunday never came had indeed become central to this mystery, but perhaps not in the way that Inspector Lennox imagined. Sometimes the most effective way to hide guilt was to ensure that suspicion fell heavily and obviously on someone else, someone whose very foreignness to the community made them a perfect scapegoat. The blue thread, the botanical knowledge, the confrontation at the grocery shop, all of these details painted a compelling picture of Mrs. Lake's guilt. But Miss Marple had learned to be suspicious of pictures that painted themselves too neatly. In her experience, the truth usually required more careful excavation, particularly when a community seemed eager to embrace an explanation that confirmed their existing prejudices while protecting them from examining uncomfortable truths about themselves. As she settled into her sitting room with her knitting, Miss Marple allowed her mind to work through the implications of Edie's observations. The hidden clue was not a dramatic revelation or an exotic poison, but something far more subtle. The careful timing of small adjustments that revealed a mind capable of thinking clearly under pressure. Someone in Little Wickham possessed both the knowledge to commit murder and the composure to cover their tracks while their victim lay dying mere feet away. The question now was not whether Mrs. Lake was guilty, but who among the apparently shocked and grieving villagers had demonstrated such cold calculation in the moments when it mattered most. The morning after Inspector Lennox's confident proclamation of Mrs. Lake's guilt brought a peculiar quality to Little Wickham, where the comfortable certainty of having identified their murderer sat uneasily with those who knew the village's deeper currents. Miss Marple understood that in small communities, the most dangerous secrets were often those hidden in plain sight, protected by the very familiarity that made neighbors invisible to one another. Her first call was to Dr. Markham, ostensibly to inquire about old Mrs. Hartwell's rheumatism, but in reality to observe the man who had been first to reach Mr. Bennet's side. She found him in his surgery, methodically cleaning instruments with the precise movements of someone seeking control through routine. His usual composure seemed strained, and Miss Marple noted how his gaze repeatedly drifted toward a locked filing cabinet in the corner. "Such a shocking business," Miss Marple observed gently, settling into the patient chair with her knitting. "You were so quick to help poor Mr. Bennet. Your medical training, I suppose." Dr. Markham's hands stilled on the instrument he was polishing. "Professional instinct," he replied carefully. "Though I confess, when I examined him, I noticed something peculiar. A faint discoloration on his lower lip, and the way he clutched his throat suggested a rapidly acting irritant. But what struck me most was that I recalled seeing him take a sip of water from the spoon dish just before reaching for Mrs. Pottle's preserve. He often did that to cleanse his palate." This revelation made Miss Marple's needles pause momentarily. If Mr. Bennet had consumed something from the water dish before tasting any preserve, it cast the entire investigation in a different light. "How observant of you, Doctor. I don't suppose you mentioned this detail to Inspector Lennox?" "I intended to," Dr. Markham said, his tone suggesting internal conflict. "But then the inspector seemed so certain about Mrs. Lake, and I wondered if I might have been mistaken." His fingers drummed against the cabinet key hanging from his watch chain. "Bennet consulted me occasionally about village matters, medical confidentialities that intersected with his legal work. He had a remarkable memory for everyone's private affairs." Miss Marple's next visit took her to Mrs. Pottle, whom she found in her kitchen garden with the aggressive energy of someone working off considerable anxiety. The strawberry plants, usually objects of maternal pride, seemed to bear the brunt of her agitation as she attacked them with pruning shears. "Such relief that the inspector has found his culprit," Mrs. Pottle declared, though her voice carried more strain than satisfaction. "That woman with her strange herbs and secretive ways. I always said she'd bring trouble to Little Wickham." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied mildly, accepting the offered cup of tea. "Though I understand Mr. Bennet had been rather trying regarding your family's trust fund. These legal matters can be so vexing." Mrs. Pottle's face flushed. "Vexing is putting it kindly. When old Mr. Finch handled our affairs, everything was straightforward and decent. But when Bennet took over the practice after Finch's death, he made everything deliberately complicated. Poor Cecily's inheritance from her grandfather, money that was rightfully hers, Bennet tied it up with demands for character references and moral assessments, said the trust required proof of worthiness before funds could be released." The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable, and Miss Marple observed how Mrs. Pottle's hands trembled as she spoke. "He seemed to enjoy making people grovel," she continued. "Used his position to humiliate anyone who needed his services, and the mortgage payments he demanded when he took over Finch's accounts. Interest rates that would make a moneylender blush." The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to the vicarage, where Miss Marple had gone to return some borrowed hymn books. Mrs. Bennet's sister had arrived from London, a sharp-eyed woman whose grief was tempered by decades of managing her brother's affairs from a distance. Mrs. Whitmore possessed the outsider's clarity that often revealed truths invisible to those living within a situation. Lionel always said this village was full of buried scandals, she confided to Miss Marple as they walked together through the churchyard. He took rather too much pleasure in knowing everyone's business, said it was useful for his legal work, but I suspected he simply enjoyed having power over people's secrets. He kept detailed files on village residents that went far beyond normal legal documentation. This observation transformed Mr. Bennet from innocent victim to someone whose knowledge might have made him dangerous to others. Mrs. Whitmore's description of her brother as a man who wielded information like a weapon suggested motives that extended far beyond simple preserve judging disputes. Their conversation was interrupted by Timothy Ashford, whose obvious distress at Mrs. Whitmore's revelations suggested personal knowledge of Mr. Bennet's methods. When pressed about his relationship with Mrs. Lake, the young curate's face flushed with embarrassment and something deeper. "Mrs. Lake has been helping me with research for my theological studies," he admitted reluctantly. "Medieval medicine and herbalism. Her botanical knowledge has been invaluable for understanding historical practices." He paused, then added with quiet defiance, "She's a good woman who's suffered enough loss without being persecuted by people who refuse to look beyond their own prejudices." The most significant revelation came when Dr. Markham arrived at the vicarage to check on Mrs. Ainsworth's nerves. His examination of Mr. Bennet's personal effects had revealed a small vial of digitalis in the man's waistcoat pocket, along with a prescription dated 3 weeks earlier. "Heart condition," Dr. Markham explained grimly. Lionel had been taking medication but hadn't told anyone. The digitalis was prescribed for his angina, but the dosage was quite specific. Too much would be fatal, and the symptoms would appear very similar to what we witnessed. This medical revelation opened possibilities that Inspector Lennox had not considered. If Mr. Bennet was already taking digitalis, someone with knowledge of his condition could have engineered his death by manipulating his medication or adding additional digitalis to something he would consume. The method would require intimate knowledge of his medical situation and understanding of the drug's properties. Miss Marple found herself considering the implications of Dr. Markham's earlier observation about Mr. Bennet's habit of sipping from the spoon dish. If the poison had been introduced into the water rather than any preserve, it would explain why the focus on Mrs. Lake's black currant entry was misdirection. The killer had relied on the assumption that poison would be found in the food itself, rather than in an ancillary element that Mr. Bennet used for his fastidious palate cleansing. The blue thread, the botanical knowledge, the confrontation at the grocery shop, all these details painted a compelling picture of Mrs. Lake's guilt. But Miss Marple had learned to be suspicious of pictures that painted themselves too neatly, particularly when a community seemed eager to embrace an explanation that confirmed their existing prejudices while protecting them from examining uncomfortable truths about themselves. As evening approached and the various revelations settled into her mind, like pieces of a complex puzzle, Miss Marple reflected on how the investigation had evolved from a simple case of preserve poisoning to something far more intricate. The house, where Sunday never came, stood silent in the distance, but its significance was becoming clearer, not as the lair of a murderous newcomer, but as a symbol of how isolation and suspicion could be manipulated to hide guilt among those who appeared most respectable. The village's secrets were beginning to surface like bodies from deep water, and Miss Marple suspected that before this matter was resolved, little Wickham would discover that the most dangerous predators were often those who had learned to hunt while wearing the protective coloring of respectability and community standing. The morning after Inspector Lennox's confident arrest of Mrs. Lake brought an unexpected visitor to Miss Marple's cottage. Young Edie Pell arrived with the earnest expression of someone who had been wrestling with troubling thoughts throughout a sleepless night. She clutched a small object wrapped in brown paper, her usual composure replaced by obvious distress. "Miss Marple," Edie began hesitantly, "I've been thinking about that blue thread, and I believe I may have misled everyone." She unwrapped the paper to reveal a small magnifying glass borrowed from the church's collection of historical artifacts. I examined Mrs. Lake's cardigan more carefully yesterday evening, and the thread that caught on her sleeve wasn't from her garment at all. The weave is completely different. Miss Marple invited the girl inside, recognizing the importance of this observation. Edie's methodical nature and attention to detail made her testimony particularly valuable, especially when she had taken the initiative to investigate further, rather than simply accepting the obvious explanation. I remembered seeing a similar thread earlier that day, Edie continued, her voice gaining confidence. Dr. Markham was leaning over the judging table during the setup, discussing something with Mr. Bennet. His jacket brushed against the white cloth, and I noticed a loose thread catch and break off. It was the same distinctive periwinkle blue. This revelation transformed Miss Marple's understanding of the evidence trail. The blue thread that had seemed to implicate Mrs. Lake was actually a connection to Dr. Markham, whose proximity to the judging table and medical knowledge had already made him a person of interest. The thread's journey from his jacket to the table to Mrs. Lake's cardigan suggested either coincidence or deliberate misdirection. Miss Marple's next stop was the village surgery, where she found Dr. Markham in his consulting room, methodically organizing patient files with the precise movements of someone seeking control through routine. His usual professional composure seemed strained, and she noticed how his gaze repeatedly drifted toward a locked cabinet in the corner, secured with an unusually heavy padlock for a medical practice. Such a relief that the inspector has resolved matters so efficiently, Dr. Markham observed when Miss Marple mentioned Mrs. Lake's arrest, though I confess I've been concerned about the thoroughness of the investigation. These village tragedies require delicate handling to avoid unnecessary distress to the community. Miss Marple found his emphasis on avoiding unnecessary distress particularly interesting, especially when coupled with his obvious anxiety. Indeed, Doctor, though I understand you were quite prompt in your response to poor Mr. Bennet's collapse, your medical training must have been invaluable in such circumstances. Professional instinct, he replied carefully, but Miss Marple noticed how his hands trembled slightly as he spoke, though I must admit the symptoms were rather unusual for a simple heart attack. The rapidity of onset, the particular discoloration around the mouth, all suggested something more complex than cardiac failure. This admission was significant, as it contradicted his earlier public statements supporting the natural death theory. Miss Marple observed how Dr. Markham seemed to be testing different explanations, perhaps gauging which version would be most acceptable or least likely to invite further scrutiny. Her afternoon visit to Mrs. Bennet's sister proved even more illuminating. Mrs. Whitmore had been sorting through her brother's personal effects and had discovered something that cast Dr. Markham's behavior in an entirely new light. Hidden within Mr. Bennet's private papers was a folder labeled Professional Concerns, containing correspondence about medical irregularities and questionable prescriptions. Lionel was meticulous about documentation, Mrs. Whitmore explained, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. These letters suggest he was investigating discrepancies in Dr. Markham's practice, patients receiving medications they hadn't requested, unusual quantities of controlled substances, and treatment records that didn't align with reported symptoms. The implications were staggering. If Mr. Bennet had been building a case against Dr. Markham's medical practice, it provided a powerful motive for murder. The doctor's knowledge of digitalis and its effects, combined with his access to Mr. Bennet during the preserve judging, created both opportunity and means for the crime. Miss Marple reflected on the cruel irony of the situation as she walked home through the village. The community had eagerly embraced Mrs. Lake's guilt because it confirmed their prejudices about outsiders while protecting them from examining uncomfortable truths about their most trusted residents. Dr. Markham, the pillar of respectability who had delivered their children and tended their ailments for decades, had used that very trust as cover for both professional misconduct and murder. The blue thread, initially seeming to condemn the innocent newcomer, had actually provided the first tangible link to the real killer. In her long experience with human nature, Miss Marple had learned that the most dangerous predators were often those who had learned to hunt while wearing the protective coloring of community standing and professional authority. As evening approached and Little Wickham settled into its false sense of security, Miss Marple prepared for the delicate task of exposing a killer who had nearly succeeded in his carefully orchestrated deception. The house where Sunday never came stood silent in the distance, but its significance was becoming clearer, not as the lair of a murderous newcomer, but as a symbol of how isolation and suspicion could be manipulated by those who understood the village's deepest fears and prejudices. Dr. Markham had counted on the community's willingness to blame the outsider, but he had underestimated both the persistence of careful observation and the inevitable way that truth emerged when someone possessed the patience to look beyond obvious explanations to the more complex realities of human motivation and opportunity. The morning after Mrs. Whitmore's revelations about her brother's files brought Miss Marple to a crucial decision. She had observed enough to form a clear theory about Mr. Bennet's death, but theories required testing, particularly when they involved someone as respected and trusted as Dr. Markham. Her long experience with human nature had taught her that the most effective way to confirm guilt was not through direct accusation, but through the careful application of psychological pressure that would cause the guilty party to reveal themselves through their reactions. She arranged her visit to the surgery with characteristic subtlety, mentioning to Mrs. Ainsworth that she had been experiencing some irregular heartbeats and thought it wise to consult Dr. Markham. The complaint was not entirely fabricated. The stress of the investigation had indeed affected her sleep, but it provided the perfect pretext for a private consultation where she could observe the doctor's behavior under carefully controlled circumstances. Dr. Markham received her in his consulting room with his usual professional courtesy, though Miss Marple's trained eye immediately detected the subtle signs of strain that had been building since Mr. Bennet's death. His movements were slightly too precise, his smile held a fraction too long, and his gaze repeatedly drifted toward the locked cabinet in the corner, the same nervous glance she had observed during their previous encounters. "Doctor," Miss Marple began gently, settling into the patient chair with her knitting bag at her side. "I've been so troubled by poor Mr. Bennet's sudden passing. Such a shock for someone who seemed in such good health." She paused, allowing her needles to begin their familiar rhythm. "Though I understand he had been consulting you about his heart condition." The effect was immediate and telling. Dr. Markham's hand, which had been reaching for his prescription pad, stilled completely. "Yes," he replied carefully. "Mr. Bennet had been prescribed digitalis for his angina, a common treatment, though it requires careful monitoring of dosage." "Indeed," Miss Marple continued with innocent interest, "I've read that digitalis can be quite dangerous if not properly managed. Too much could cause exactly the symptoms we witnessed at the fete. The rapid collapse, the particular discoloration around the mouth." She looked up from her knitting with mild curiosity. "I suppose someone with medical knowledge would understand precisely how such an overdose might occur." Dr. Markham's face had gone pale, and Miss Marple noticed the slight tremor that had developed in his left hand. "The therapeutic window is quite narrow," he admitted, his voice strained. But Mr. Bennet was well informed about his medication. He followed instructions precisely. "Oh, I'm certain he did," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "Mr. Bennet was nothing if not methodical, which makes one wonder how such a careful man could have made such a fatal error. Unless, of course, his usual routine was somehow altered." She allowed the implication to settle before continuing. "I noticed during the preserve, judging that he had his customary habit of cleansing his palate with water between tastings. Such a fastidious man." The mention of the water dish caused Dr. Markham to shift uncomfortably in his chair. His eyes darted involuntarily toward the locked cabinet, then back to Miss Marple, who continued her knitting with serene concentration. "You were so prompt in responding to his collapse," she observed. Your medical training, naturally, but also your position near the judging table gave you an excellent vantage point to observe everything that occurred. "I was simply doing my duty as a physician," Dr. Markham replied, but his voice had taken on a defensive quality that hadn't been there moments before. Perspiration had begun to form along his hairline despite the cool morning air. Miss Marple looked up with the expression of someone struck by a sudden thought. "That blue thread we found at the judging table. Young Edie mentioned it came from your jacket. Such an observant girl." She also noticed how the water dish was moved several times during the afternoon, including once during all the confusion after Mr. Bennet's collapse. Her tone remained conversational, but her blue eyes had sharpened with unmistakable purpose. One wonders what might have required such careful attention to that particular detail at such a moment of crisis. Dr. Markham stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with jarring suddenness. "Miss Marple, I hardly think this speculation is appropriate. The police have made their arrest, and the matter is closed." His hand moved instinctively toward the locked cabinet, fingers fumbling with the key that hung from his watch chain. "Is it closed, though?" Miss Marple asked gently, her knitting needles never pausing in their steady rhythm. "I've found that in matters involving human nature, things are rarely as simple as they first appear, particularly when someone with specialized knowledge, medical knowledge for instance, finds themselves in a position where they might feel compelled to take desperate action." The key slipped from Dr. Markham's trembling fingers, falling to the floor with a small metallic sound that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. As he bent to retrieve it, Miss Marple observed the way his shoulders shook with barely controlled tension, the manner in which his breathing had become shallow and rapid, and most tellingly, the look of trapped desperation that had replaced his professional composure. "Mr. Bennet had quite a collection of files," Miss Marple continued conversationally, documenting various aspects of village life that most people preferred to keep private. His sister mentioned that he took particular interest in professional matters, medical practices, legal procedures, financial irregularities, the sort of information that could be quite damaging if it fell into the wrong hands, or quite valuable if one needed leverage over someone whose cooperation was required. Dr. Markham straightened slowly, the retrieved key clutched in his white-knuckled fist. His face had gone ashen, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm simply observing," Miss Marple replied with gentle finality, "that sometimes the most respected members of a community find themselves in situations where their reputations, their livelihoods, even their freedom depend upon the silence of others, and when that silence is threatened." She let the sentence trail off, her meaning clear. The psychological test was complete. Dr. Markham's reactions had confirmed every suspicion Miss Marple had harbored. The guilty knowledge, the desperate fear, the protective instincts toward his locked cabinet, all painted a clear picture of a man whose carefully constructed life was built upon secrets that Mr. Bennet had discovered and exploited. As she gathered her knitting and prepared to leave, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony of the situation. The village had eagerly embraced Mrs. Lake's guilt because it confirmed their prejudices about outsiders, while the real killer had hidden behind the protective armor of professional respectability and community trust. But as she had learned through decades of observing human nature, the most dangerous predators were often those who had learned to hunt while wearing the most convincing disguises. The house where Sunday never came stood silent in the distance, but its symbolic significance was becoming clear. Like Dr. Markham himself, it represented the facade of respectability that could conceal the darkest secrets in the way that isolation, whether physical or moral, could corrupt even those who appeared most worthy of trust. The final confrontation was now inevitable, and Miss Marple prepared herself for the delicate task of exposing a killer who had nearly succeeded in his carefully orchestrated deception. The evening shadows stretched across the vicarage drawing room as Miss Marple arranged her carefully orchestrated gathering with the deceptive casualness of someone organizing an impromptu tea party. Inspector Lennox sat stiffly beside the fireplace, his confidence in Mrs. Lake's guilt beginning to show hairline cracks under Miss Marple's persistent questioning. Dr. Markham had arrived precisely on time, though she noticed his usual punctuality was accompanied by an unusual pallor in the way his medical bag remained clutched in his hand like a talisman against approaching disaster. Mrs. Whitmore occupied the chair nearest the window, her brother's private papers arranged on the side table with deliberate prominence. Timothy Ashford sat protectively beside Mrs. Lake, whose composed demeanor could not entirely mask the strain of her ordeal. Young Edie Pell perched on the edge of her chair, her notebook ready, having been specifically requested to attend as a witness to the fate's events. "I do hope you'll forgive this rather unusual gathering," Miss Marple began gently, her knitting needles moving in their familiar rhythm, "but certain inconsistencies have emerged that I believe require clarification before Mrs. Lake's case proceeds further." Her blue eyes moved thoughtfully around the room, noting how Dr. Markham had positioned himself near the door and how his gaze kept drifting toward Mrs. Whitmore's papers. "Inspector Lennox has built his case on the assumption that poison was introduced through Mrs. Lake's preserve," Miss Marple continued conversationally. "But I find myself troubled by several small details that don't quite align with that theory. The blue thread, for instance, which young Edie so carefully observed." Edie straightened, pleased to have her observations valued. "The thread came from Dr. Markham's jacket, Miss Marple. I saw it catch on the judging table during the morning setup, and later fragments appeared on Mrs. Lake's preserve cap and cardigan." Dr. Markham's face tightened almost imperceptibly, but Miss Marple caught the subtle change in his breathing pattern. "How observant of you, dear," she said approvingly. "It suggests the thread created a trail that led away from its actual source, rather than toward the true culprit." "Threads can transfer in any number of innocent ways," Dr. Markham interjected, though his voice carried a defensive edge that hadn't been there moments before. "The fate was crowded. People brushed against each other constantly." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "Though combined with other observations, it begins to paint a rather different picture. You see, I've been particularly intrigued by Mr. Bennet's habit of cleansing his palate with water between tastings. Several witnesses noted him taking a sip from the spoon dish just before his collapse. The effect on Dr. Markham was immediate and telling. His knuckles whitened where they gripped his medical bag, and a fine sheen of perspiration appeared along his hairline despite the cool evening air. Miss Marple observed these physiological responses with the trained eye of someone who understood that guilt often revealed itself through the body's involuntary reactions. "The water dish," Miss Marple continued with deceptive mildness, "was moved several times during the afternoon. Edie made 2 official changes at Mr. Bennet's request, but there was a third movement, during the confusion after his collapse. Someone adjusted it while everyone's attention was focused on the fallen man. Mrs. Whitmore chose this moment to speak, her voice carrying the weight of recent revelations. "My brother kept extensive files on village residents, including correspondence about medical irregularities and questionable prescriptions. Dr. Markham features prominently in his private papers." The revelation struck Dr. Markham like a physical blow. His careful composure cracked visibly, revealing the desperate fear beneath his professional facade. "Bennet was a vindictive man who enjoyed destroying people's reputations," he said hoarsely, the words escaping before he could stop them. "Miss—" Marple leaned forward slightly, her needles pausing in their rhythm. "Mr. Bennet prescribed digitalis for his heart condition, didn't he, Doctor? You would know precisely how much would constitute a therapeutic dose, and how much would prove fatal. The symptoms you described so accurately suggest intimate familiarity with digitalis poisoning." "I was simply making a medical observation," Dr. Markham protested, but his voice had become strained, almost pleading. Perspiration now beaded openly on his forehead, and his hands trembled as they clutched his medical bag. "The locked cabinet in your surgery," Miss Marple observed gently, has been troubling you considerably since the fete. I suspect it contains evidence of the professional irregularities that Mr. Bennet was documenting. Perhaps records of unauthorized prescriptions or controlled substances that don't align with your official dispensary logs. The psychological pressure was building with surgical precision, each observation adding another weight to Dr. Markham's burden of guilt. Miss Marple watched as his breathing became increasingly shallow, his eyes darting frantically between the assembled faces that now regarded him with dawning suspicion rather than professional respect. "He was blackmailing you, wasn't he?" Miss Marple said softly, the words falling into the evening silence like stones into still water. "Not for money, but for compliance, using your professional mistakes to ensure your cooperation in his various schemes." Dr. Markham's composure finally shattered completely. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice breaking with the weight of months of torment. "He had evidence that could destroy everything, my practice, my reputation, my family's future. Every week brought new demands, new compromises, until I barely recognized the man I'd become." The partial confession hung in the air like an accusation, confirming everything Miss Marple had deduced about the relationship between victim and killer. The respected physician and the meticulous solicitor, both pillars of the community, locked in a dance of corruption that could only end in violence. Inspector Lennox reached for his notebook with the mechanical movements of someone whose certainties had just been fundamentally shaken, while Mrs. Lake's face showed the first glimmer of hope she had felt since her arrest. The psychological test was complete, and Dr. Markham's guilt stood exposed in all its tragic complexity. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, preparing for the final revelation that would complete her reconstruction of the crime and restore justice to Little Wickham's disrupted peace. The silence that followed Dr. Markham's broken admission settled over the vicarage drawing room like evening mist, heavy with the weight of revelation and the collapse of long-held certainties. Miss Marple allowed the quiet to gather before speaking, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had witnessed such moments many times before. "I believe we must now examine the true method of Mr. Bennet's murder," she began, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm. "The poison was never in any preserve, you see. It was introduced into the water dish that Mr. Bennet used to cleanse his palate between tastings, a habit so well established that anyone familiar with his judging methods could predict it with absolute certainty." Inspector Lennox leaned forward, his earlier confidence in Mrs. Lake's guilt now thoroughly shaken. "But the dish was changed twice during the afternoon." "Precisely," Miss Marple replied with quiet satisfaction, "and therein lies the elegance of Dr. Markham's plan. He knew that young Edie would dutifully change the water when requested, providing him with opportunities to introduce a concentrated dose of digitalis, far exceeding Mr. Bennet's prescribed therapeutic amount, into the fresh water. The symptoms we witnessed were entirely consistent with acute digitalis poisoning." Dr. Markham sat motionless, his medical bag abandoned at his feet like a discarded symbol of the healing profession he had betrayed. His face bore the gray pallor of a man whose carefully constructed world had finally collapsed around him. "The blue thread was your masterstroke," Miss Marple continued, addressing him directly. "During your morning conversation with Mr. Bennet, it caught on the judging table. Later, you deliberately transferred fragments to Mrs. Lake's preserve cap and cardigan, creating a false trail that would lead investigators directly to the newcomer whose botanical knowledge and foreign ways made her such a convenient suspect." Mrs. Whitmore spoke with controlled anger, her brother's papers rustling in her lap. Lionel had documented months of irregularities in Dr. Markham's practice. Patients receiving medications they never requested, controlled substances disappearing from inventory records. He was building a case that would have destroyed the doctor's career. "So Mr. Bennet became your blackmailer," Miss Marple observed gently, "using his evidence to compel your cooperation in various schemes, demanding favors that compromised your professional integrity until you saw murder as your only escape." Dr. Markham finally raised his head, his voice barely above a whisper. He was destroying everything I'd worked for, piece by piece. Every week brought new demands, new humiliations. I couldn't let him continue. But you nearly destroyed an innocent woman in the process, Timothy Ashford said, his protective instincts toward Mrs. Lake evident in his tone. Miss Marple nodded sadly. The most insidious aspect was how Dr. Markham exploited our natural prejudices. The village was predisposed to suspect the outsider, the woman with her unusual plants and secretive ways. He counted on our willingness to embrace an explanation that confirmed our existing fears while protecting us from examining uncomfortable truths about ourselves. Young Edie spoke up hesitantly. The third time the water dish was moved, during the confusion after Mr. Bennet collapsed. Dr. Markham's final precaution, Miss Marple explained. While everyone focused on the fallen man, he subtly adjusted the dish to remove any residual traces of digitalis that might contradict the preserve poisoning theory. It required remarkable composure to think so clearly while his victim lay dying mere feet away. Inspector Lennox rose with the measured movements of a man whose understanding of the case had been fundamentally altered. Dr. James Markham, I'm arresting you for the murder of Mr. Lionel Bennet. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be taken down and used in evidence. As the handcuffs closed around his wrists, Dr. Markham looked at Miss Marple with something approaching gratitude mixed with despair. How long have you known? From the moment someone demonstrated the presence of mind to alter evidence while others were paralyzed by shock, she replied softly. In my experience, such calculated behavior in crisis reveals the mind capable of planning murder. When the door closed behind the arrested man, the room seemed to exhale collectively. Mrs. Lake's face showed the first genuine relief she had felt since the nightmare began, while Timothy Ashford moved protectively closer to her side. Miss Marple gathered her knitting with careful precision, reflecting on the tragic irony of the situation. The village had eagerly embraced the guilt of a stranger, while the true danger had hidden behind the mask of professional respectability and community trust. Dr. Markham had nearly succeeded in his deception, counting on little Wickham's willingness to blame the outsider rather than examine the darkness that could lurk within their most trusted institutions. As evening settled over the village, Miss Marple walked home through streets that would soon return to their familiar rhythms, though forever changed by the knowledge that the greatest threats often came not from mysterious strangers, but from those who had learned to hunt while wearing the most convincing disguises of respectability. The house where Sunday never came stood silent in the distance, no longer a symbol of mysterious menace, but a reminder that isolation and suspicion could be manipulated by those who understood the community's deepest fears. In the end, Sunday had come to Little Wickham after all, bringing with it the reckoning that truth always demands.